The FIA admitted what it never had before, that its own penalty decision might be wrong. It happened quietly, buried within the bureaucracy of race control, hidden in two documents that told opposite stories. On paper, it was just another 10-second penalty. In reality, it was an institutional contradiction, one that shook the foundations of sporting credibility. Inside the steward's office at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, the air was dense with tension. The Mexico City altitude didn't just thin the oxygen, it thinned the line between reason and authority. In one moment, Lewis Hamilton was a driver managing the limits of physics. In the next, he was the subject of an FIA contradiction that made no mechanical sense. Because this time, the data, the radio, and the words written by the FIA itself refused to align. And once truth and authority diverge, Formula One loses something far more fragile than time: trust. It began on lap 39, turn 4, a left-hander that compresses the physics of high-altitude racing into a single second of decision-making. Hamilton and Verstappen arrived side by side, both pushing braking markers to the edge of plausibility. Then came the lock-up, a white puff from the front right wheel, and a trajectory that stopped obeying geometry. Telemetry later confirmed what the onboard cameras couldn't show. Hamilton's brake pressure spiked to nearly 100%. The front tyres lost adhesion, and downforce, already starved by Mexico's thin air, vanished. In that instant, his Ferrari, loaded with energy, speed, and zero grip, refused to rotate. The car slid forward, helpless over the escape road. It wasn't a choice. It was physics overriding control. Yet when the dust settled, Hamilton had rejoined ahead of Verstappen. To the casual eye, an advantage gained. To the sensors, a time delta of just 0.03 seconds over the previous lap. Statistically insignificant. And that's where the story should have ended. The FIA's own stewards in document 37 recognised the lack of control, stating explicitly that Hamilton's trajectory made it physically impossible to follow the prescribed re-entry route. It was an acknowledgement of cause and context, a rare moment of human understanding within regulation. But simultaneously, document 36 declared the opposite, a 10-second penalty for gaining a lasting advantage outside track limits. Two official decisions, same incident, same lap, same driver. In one, Hamilton is exonerated for circumstances beyond his control. In the other, punished for the consequence of those same circumstances. What made the contradiction even more striking was the timing. Both documents issued within minutes, both carrying the same FIA header, both signed by the same panel. The stewards, it seemed, had recognised the truth and sanctioned it anyway. That fracture between technical fact and procedural rigidity was the moment Formula One's trust in its own system began to bend. Because when the rulebook punishes physics instead of intent, it stops being a code of fairness and becomes an algorithm of confusion. If Section 1 exposed the contradiction, Section 2 reveals the evidence. The fine print, the telemetry, and the quiet chaos of two official FIA documents that could not coexist. Because what emerged after Mexico wasn't a conspiracy theory whispered through forums or fan threads. It was written, signed, and time-stamped inside the FIA's own system. Document 37 came first, time-stamped at 17:06 local time. It described Hamilton's off-track excursion with measured precision. The stewards noted that car 44 locked its brakes entering turn 4, resulting in a loss of control, making it impossible to take the prescribed escape route. It acknowledged the conditions: high brake temperatures, loss of downforce at altitude, and the fact that Hamilton's re-entry had been dictated by circumstance, not by choice. The final line read, "No further action." For 10 minutes, that was the official truth. Then came document 36, published at 17:16, same header, same stewards. Opposite conclusion. It stated, the driver of car 44 left the track and gained a lasting advantage. A 10-second penalty was imposed, citing a breach of Article 33.3 of the sporting regulations, the rule governing track limits and advantage. Nowhere in that article does it define intent. It simply measures outcome. If a car leaves the track and emerges in a more favourable position, it must relinquish that position or face sanction. But the question that Mexico exposed is one Formula One has avoided for years. Can advantage exist without intent? The FIA had effectively said two things at once. Hamilton couldn't follow the escape route because the car was uncontrollable, but he must still be penalised for not following it. In logic, that's circular reasoning. In sport, it's chaos disguised as procedure. Inside the paddock, engineers exchanged glances more than words. Ferrari's data analysts had already confirmed that Hamilton's sector time was identical to lap 38, 28.963 seconds through sector 1, despite leaving the track. No delta gain, no evidence of deliberate overspeed. The data was clean, and yet the punishment stood. The real story wasn't in the documents themselves, but in what they represented, an internal system that could recognize truth in one paragraph and erase it in the next. The FIA didn't just contradict itself, it validated both sides of an argument that should have had only one conclusion. Because if the data says no gain, and the stewards say lasting advantage, then the only thing gained is doubt. The Mexico Grand Prix has always been an engineer's nightmare disguised as a driver's challenge. At over 2002, 100 meters above sea level, the Autódromo Hermanos Rodriguez doesn't behave like any other track on the calendar. The thin air means less oxygen, less cooling, and far less downforce. What would be a balanced car in Monza or Suzuka becomes a nervous, overheating compromise in Mexico. Ferrari knew this before the weekend even began. Brake ducts were widened by 2 millimeters, caliper temperatures monitored lap by lap, and driver feedback prioritized over simulation. But even those precautions weren't enough. On lap 39, Hamilton's front right disc reached 900 degrees Celsius, 50 above the ideal threshold. In that condition, the carbon material begins to glaze. Pedal feel becomes inconsistent. The braking distance extends by more than 4 meters. At those speeds, 4 meters is a lifetime. Hamilton braked at the same marker he'd used all race, but the physics had changed. The pedal travel was deeper, the wheels locked earlier, and aerodynamic load on the front axle had dropped by nearly 6% because of DRS turbulence from Verstappen's car. Once the lockup began, it couldn't be undone. The tyres skated across the asphalt, heat built exponentially, and steering input became ornamental. This wasn't driver error, it was mechanical inevitability. Yet the FIA's sanction treated it as an act of choice. To understand why, you have to look at how regulations perceive cause and effect. Article 33.3 doesn't care why a driver leaves the track. It only asks what happens next. In Hamilton's case, the what was simple. He rejoined ahead. The why, a combination of thermal fade and downforce deficit, was invisible to the wording of the rulebook. That gap between engineering reality and bureaucratic rigidity is where Formula One often loses itself. The system is built to measure outcomes, not intent, data, not circumstance. And so when a regulation written in the abstract collides with a moment governed by physics, one side always bends. In Mexico, it was the driver who bent first, then the logic that judged him. Because if the FIA's interpretation ignores the limits of machinery, it risks punishing not decisions but physics itself. When the radio went silent, it said more than words ever could. Lewis Hamilton has built a career on communication, real-time translation of data into instinct, emotion into feedback. But on lap 40 in Mexico, after rejoining ahead of Verstappen and realizing he might face investigation, Hamilton said nothing. The onboard mic caught only controlled breathing, a soft throttle modulation, and the low hum of ERS deployment. For 13 seconds, the man who built his legend on decisive radio exchanges was quiet. That silence wasn't avoidance, it was calculation. He knew the penalty debate wasn't about driving anymore, it was about interpretation. His engineer, Riccardo Adami, also stayed off comms. Ferrari's strategy wall was already cross-referencing the FIA's event notes. The moment the incident involving cars 44 and 1 appeared on timing screens, the message was clear. They were in bureaucratic territory. Adami eventually broke the silence with a single line. Copy understood. We'll discuss later. In Ferrari language, that's not reassurance. It's containment. It means we know what just happened, but we can't fix it from here. Hamilton's face inside the helmet told the rest. His eyes flicked toward the delta screen twice, calculating Verstappen's gain, watching the gap remain under a second. He wasn't defending a position. He was defending a principle, that intent matters, that physics should be acknowledged, and that racing still had room for human judgment. In the cool-down room later, he said it plainly to an Italian journalist. If they see the data, they'll understand I had no control. I didn't gain anything. He wasn't angry. He was resigned. That emotional restraint is a different kind of protest, one that comes from experience. Hamilton has lived through penalties that reshaped championships. Spa 2008, Abu Dhabi 2021, Jeddah 2023. Each taught him that outrage achieves less than precision. So in Mexico, he didn't argue. He let telemetry do the talking. But for Ferrari's garage, the tone was unmistakable. This was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of disbelief. Because when a driver who has seen everything no longer feels the need to defend himself, it's not acceptance, it's fatigue. And fatigue in Formula One is the first step toward distrust. When the two documents appeared in the post-race bulletin system, reaction inside the paddock was cautious but immediate. At first, it was quiet recognition. Engineers cross-checking PDFs, team managers confirming timestamps. Within an hour, the contradiction was circulating privately among strategy directors. The question wasn't who was right, it was how both could be. For the FIA, the problem went beyond paperwork. Formula One's entire governance model depends on a single principle: procedural consistency. Teams accept penalties they disagree with because they trust the process, not the outcome. But in Mexico, the process contradicted itself. The same stewards panel had acknowledged a loss of control and then punished the unavoidable result of that loss. Ferrari's initial response was measured. Fred Vasseur told Italian media that the team would review the reasoning internally, a diplomatic phrase, masking deep frustration. The internal debrief focused less on the 10-second loss and more on what it meant for precedent. If an FIA document could simultaneously clear and condemn, then the next similar incident could be interpreted any way a future panel wished. At Red Bull, the stance was predictably procedural. Verstappen's engineers emphasized that the rules are applied by outcome. It was not defiance, it was strategic distance. Mercedes, watching from afar, noted the contradiction but avoided public comment, quietly updating their internal case studies on stewarding reliability. By Monday evening, media outlets were running side-by-side comparisons of the documents. Technical reporters pointed out that both carried identical reference numbers except for sequence, proof they were issued minutes apart. The optics were damaging enough. 2 official verdicts, 1 driver, 1 incident, no reconciliation. Former officials began to comment in professional forums. Some called it an administrative oversight, others a procedural misalignment. None could remember another instance where 2 FIA communications had effectively cancelled each other out. Inside the teams, a more serious conversation began. If contradictions of this scale can occur without explanation, how much trust can be placed in unseen decisions? The protests that never reach public view, the closed-door clarifications. Mexico had done more than expose a paperwork flaw. It had shaken confidence in the referee itself. And when confidence falters at the top of Formula One's regulatory chain, every protest, every appeal, every future sanction inherits a shadow of doubt. The penalty was finite. The uncertainty it created was not. What Mexico really changed wasn't just Hamilton's final classification, it was the way teams thought about risk versus interpretation. Up to that point, most strategy groups operated under an assumption. If we can prove, with telemetry and video, that the driver had no control, the FIA will take context into account. Mexico showed that this assumption was fragile. Ferrari were the first to plug the hole. In the Tuesday post-race debrief, analysts flagged the gap between what the FIA acknowledged, loss of control, and what the FIA punished, lasting advantage. The conclusion was uncomfortable. From now on, if a driver left the track and emerged ahead, even unintentionally, the safest operational response was to give the position back immediately, regardless of whether the team believed the driver was justified, not because it was fair, but because it removed discretion from the stewards. Mercedes, watching from the outside, drew a similar line. One strategist summarized it in a note: "We can't rely on intent being considered, outcome only." That's a very different Formula One to the one where drivers could radio, "I was pushed wide," and see leniency. This was outcome-led adjudication. Red Bull, for their part, saw an opportunity. A system that is strictly outcome-based is a system you can weaponize. If your rival goes off and keeps the place, even in a racing situation, even with a lockup, you can immediately call for position not returned. Mexico had just provided the example, and because the FIA itself had shown it could contradict earlier leniency with a later penalty, teams now had precedent to keep pushing long after the incident. The result? Strategy. She became more conservative on track and more aggressive off it. Drivers would be told faster, "Give it back." Team managers would protest harder. They didn't. Everything shifted a few seconds earlier, a few decibels louder. And that's the irony of Mexico. A penalty given for a situation the FIA admitted was unavoidable ended up making Formula One less racy. Because when drivers fear that even an unintentional off will be punished, they don't dive. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much in Formula One, On television, it's a pit stop, a slow in-lap, a brief delay at the lights. But in a season, decided by margins thinner than a brake disc, 10 seconds can be the difference between narrative and nightmare. After Mexico, the official classification showed Hamilton 6th instead of 4th. On paper, that meant a loss of just 6 points. But in a season where the top 3 teams were separated by less than 40, those 6 points became symbolic. They didn't only alter standings, they changed development priorities, political leverage, and even internal morale. Inside Ferrari, engineers understood that points are not isolated numbers. They shape the tone of the next upgrade meeting, the size of next week's risk window, the confidence with which a team argues for a setup direction. A 10-second penalty is measurable in points, but its hidden cost is psychological. A team that believes it was wronged begins to drive defensively in every sense. Every overtaking call becomes a legal calculation. For Red Bull, the outcome reinforced an opposite lesson. Verstappen's crew saw confirmation that aggression still pays when the system hesitates. Let the stewards decide later became a subtext for risk management. The advantage of political certainty, of knowing how far you can push, often outweighs pure pace. Mexico proved that ambiguity can be an asset if you're willing to operate inside it. Mercedes, meanwhile, drew quiet satisfaction from distance. Hamilton's former team had been burned by inconsistency before, in Jeddah and Abu Dhabi, and saw the Ferrari incident as vindication of a long-held complaint. Clarity is a performance factor. Every rule left open to interpretation adds weight to decision-making on the pit wall, where milliseconds decide whether to pit, hold, or yield. By the time the championship reached São Paulo, that 10-second penalty was still echoing through simulator runs and technical briefings. Ferrari analysts estimated that if the same decision logic were applied in later rounds, it could shift the constructors' standings by more than 12 points, enough to influence prize money distribution and off-season testing allocations. 10 seconds in isolation is trivial. 10 seconds applied inconsistently becomes structural, because championships are not won by speed alone. They're won by how much of that speed you're allowed to keep. Every sport has its defining contradictions. The moments that expose what happens when the written word collides with lived reality. For Formula One, Mexico 2025 will sit among them. It wasn't the most dramatic crash, the biggest scandal, or even a title-deciding call, but it was the moment the steward's language diverged from the sport's logic, and that fracture ran deeper than any single penalty. The FIA's decision wasn't malicious, it was mechanical. A system built to process outcomes treated intent as noise. But racing is human, a synthesis of reflex and physics. When a driver locks a brake at 900 degrees Celsius in thin air, that's not advantage seeking, it's survival. Mexico revealed that the rulebook had reached its limit. It could describe what happened, but not why. Inside the paddock, Mexico became shorthand for procedural tension. Every briefing after that weekend referenced it. "Remember Mexico," engineers would say when debating track limit scenarios. It wasn't about Hamilton anymore. It was about control, about where judgment should live, in telemetry, or in the eyes of those who interpret it. The FIA quietly reviewed its internal workflows, introducing a cross-verification protocol for race documents. No public statement, no admission of fault, just a silent patch to prevent a repeat. Yet even that discreet correction carried meaning. Institutions rarely fix what they don't recognize as broken. For the drivers, the message was subtler but heavier. If the stewards can contradict themselves within 10 minutes, then anyone can be vulnerable to the same procedural uncertainty. It breeds a kind of invisible caution, a hesitation not to push a limit, but to trust that the limit will be judged fairly when they do. That's why Mexico felt like a hinge moment. It forced Formula One to ask what fairness actually means in a sport defined by imperfection. Rules are necessary, but judgment is inevitable. Telemetry is absolute, but interpretation is human. Somewhere between those truths lies the essence of racing. And in Mexico, that balance slipped, just enough to remind everyone how fragile it really is. In the end, the Mexico penalty was less about Lewis Hamilton than it was about the boundaries of interpretation. The data showed no deliberate gain, the documents showed internal contradiction, and the reaction from teams revealed a collective unease that the system meant to regulate fairness could undermine it. For Ferrari, it became a lesson in control, and not just of the car, but of narrative. For the FIA, it was a quiet warning. The sports authority is only as strong as its consistency. No rulebook, however detailed, can survive contradiction without losing credibility. The moment two documents bearing the same logo told opposite truths, Formula One's moral foundation shook. And yet, this isn't a story of villains or victims. It's a story about the complexity of judgment in a sport where precision meets chaos. The FIA didn't act out of malice, but out of the rigidity of its own systems. Hamilton didn't defy rules, he defied physics. Somewhere between those realities lies the truth of Mexico 2025. The lesson is simple. When regulation tries to measure the immeasurable, intent, instinct, human error, it must evolve or risk making truth optional. So the question that lingers is this: should Formula One's rules remain blind to circumstance, punishing outcomes regardless of context, or should they evolve to recognize intent when the data supports it? If a driver's only mistake is reacting faster than physics allows, should that still count as a sporting breach? The answer will shape the next decade of stewarding philosophy. Because as cars become more complex, as sensors multiply and data flows faster, the ability to distinguish accident from advantage will define whether Formula One remains a sport of precision or becomes a sport of paperwork. Mexico was a moment of exposure, a reminder that even in the most data-driven competition on Earth, the human element is not the weakness. It's the truth.